family vacations, those rare moments when I could truly disconnect from everything. No school, no pressure, just peace and fun. That summer, my parents decided we'd spend a week at a remote hotel deep in the countryside. You know the kind of place. Frozen in time, with old furniture, endless hallways, and decor that hadn't been updated in decades. At first, I was disappointed. There was no decent Wi-Fi and no activities for someone my age. But over time, I started to get used to the boredom. On the third day, I met her. I was sitting in the lobby, listening to music on my MP3 player when Elisa showed up. She seemed normal, maybe even overly friendly. She was one of those people who talk nonstop, and before I could even react, she was telling me that she too was stuck there with her parents and thought the hotel was the most boring place in the world. At that moment, I felt relieved. Until then, I hadn't seen anyone my age around, and the idea of having someone to talk to sounded like a good distraction. We spent the rest of the afternoon wandering the hotel hallways, exploring the common areas, and making up stories about the other guests. Elisa was funny, but something about her made me uneasy. I can't quite explain it. Maybe it was how quickly her mood shifted, or the way her jokes sometimes felt a little too cruel. I chalked it up to me overthinking things and ignored it. It wasn't until she suggested we go to the attic that I realized something was really off. She said she had something amazing to show me, but there was a strange glint in her eyes, like she was testing me to see if I'd follow. I didn't want to go. I can't explain why, but something in my gut told me to make up an excuse, to say I was tired or that my parents were waiting for me. But Elisa persisted. "It's just an old room. What's the big deal? Or are you scared?" she teased, flashing that challenging smile that made me feel like a coward if I refused. Reluctantly, I followed her through the hallways to a wooden door leading to the attic. The space was dusty, filled with old furniture and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. As soon as we stepped inside, I noticed how oppressive the silence was. Elisa seemed thrilled, like this was the adventure of a lifetime. While I glanced around, trying to figure out what she wanted to show me, she shut the door behind us. "Now, no one can bother us," she murmured, her voice suddenly colder. That's when I saw it. Her expression had changed. The friendly smile I'd seen in the lobby was gone, replaced by something unsettling. Her eyes carried an eerie intensity. "Have you ever thought about how easy it is to hurt someone here?" she asked suddenly, her voice low, as if sharing a dark secret. My throat went dry. I let out a nervous laugh, hoping it was just a bad joke, but then she pulled something out of her pocket, a knife. Small, the kind that could go unnoticed, but sharp enough to make me freeze in place. She held it like a toy, spinning it between her fingers, and smiled again. "Do you think it's sharp enough?" she asked casually, as though this was a perfectly normal question. I was paralyzed, unable to move. My heart raced, and every instinct screamed for me to run, but I couldn't. I could only stare at the knife in her hands, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Are you scared? Relax, I'm just joking," she said. But her laugh didn't put me at ease. It was dry, forced, and only made everything feel more wrong. When I took a step back, she moved closer. Not quickly, but enough to make me retreat further. The attic was small, and I soon realized There was nowhere to go. "Why are you acting like this? I just want to show you how cowardly people can be," she said, her tone almost instructional, as if teaching some twisted moral lesson. Every word she spoke made my stomach churn. I tried to stay calm, speaking as calmly as I could, telling her I needed to leave because my parents were waiting for me. It was pointless. "You think you can leave whenever you want?" she asked, her eyes now wide open. That's when I realized the knife wasn't just a joke. Elisa was serious, and I had no idea what she was thinking. All I could think about was getting out of there in one piece. I glanced at the door behind her, calculating the distance and trying to imagine if I could make it before she did anything. But before I could make a move, she stepped aside and began cutting into one of the old boxes. "See? It's not that hard," she murmured. And the blade tore through the cardboard with a sharp sound that seemed to echo in the silence. In that moment, it felt like I was stuck in one of those nightmares where you're running but going nowhere. Everything inside me screamed that I needed to get out, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Elisa kept cutting the box, lost in her own thoughts, and it only made my anxiety worse. "You know, people think they're safe because they're surrounded by others," she suddenly said, without even looking at me. "But no one realizes what can happen when no one's watching." I didn't know how to respond. My mind was on high alert, trying to figure out how to get out of there without provoking her even more. That's when I came up with a desperate idea. I said I'd heard a noise outside, something that sounded like footsteps. "I think someone's coming," I said, trying to sound as natural as possible. For a moment, she stopped. She stood silent, staring at the door as if trying to hear what I had just said. I took advantage of the distraction to move slowly toward the exit. Every step felt like a huge risk, but I knew I had to leave before things got worse. Just as I was about to reach the door, the floor creaked under my feet. Elisa turned to me so fast it seemed impossible. "You think you can fool me?" she shouted, gripping the knife tightly. My body reacted before my mind could process, and I ran. I shoved the door with all my strength and threw myself outside, stumbling down the stairs. I could hear her footsteps behind me, fast and determined, and my heart felt like it was about to burst. I ran like I had never run before, almost tripping down the steps. I could hear her footsteps echoing down the hall, but I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to reach someone, anyone, before she caught up with me. When I reached the ground floor, the lobby was crowded with guests, and I screamed for help without thinking twice. My scream made everyone turn, and the look of confusion on their faces quickly turned to shock when Elisa appeared behind me, still holding the knife. It was a chaotic scene. People shouting, some trying to get out, others drawing attention to her to protect me. That's when I saw the hotel manager running toward us, trying to calm things down. But Elisa was completely out of control. She started swinging the knife in the air, as if trying to push anyone away who came too close. I hid behind the counter, shaking with fear, while the manager tried talking to her. Nothing she said made sense. "They don't understand," Elisa repeated, almost crying, but her eyes locked on me. I've never felt so exposed in my life, as if every move I made could make things worse. A few minutes later, though it felt like an eternity, someone finally called the police. The sound of sirens was a relief, but it also brought more panic. As soon as Elisa realized the police were coming, she lost it completely, knocking everything around her and trying to escape. It took 3 guests and the manager to hold her down until the police arrived. I could only watch from a distance, unable to process what was happening. When the police finally managed to subdue her, the entire hotel was in a state of shock. Elisa was screaming nonsensical things as she was led away in handcuffs, and I was still hiding behind the counter, trying to understand how everything had escalated so quickly. A paramedic came to me, trying to calm me down and asking if I was hurt. I couldn't answer. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly hold them steady, and my mind was spinning with the images of her holding the knife, her eyes locked on me as if I were the cause of everything. Some guests came over to try to comfort me, but they all had the same expression. Fear. Not just for Elisa, but for the possibility that something much worse could have happened. After a while, my family and I decided we couldn't stay there for another night. As we packed our things in the room, I overheard my parents whispering. They were trying to decide whether to ask for a refund or just leave. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. On the way to the car, I saw a few police officers talking to the manager. They had Elisa's knife in a plastic bag, and just looking at it made my stomach twist. When we finally got into the car and drove away from the hotel, I realized I was crying without even noticing. To this day, I still can't understand how someone so young can become so dangerous in such a short amount of time. And what scares me the most is thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't made it out of that attic. Once we got home, I thought maybe things would get better with time. But honestly, it wasn't that simple. For weeks, I dreamed of Elisa. The image of her holding the knife, that insane look in her eyes that seemed to pierce through my soul, still haunts me whenever I'm alone. I tried to avoid talking about what happened, but the questions kept coming, especially from friends and family who had heard the story. My answers were always vague because deep down, I still couldn't explain how it all happened. I didn't know who Elisa was, where she came from, or what drove her to act that way. Everything felt so surreal, yet so incredibly real. The hotel contacted us a few days later to offer an apology and a courtesy voucher, but the thought of returning there was simply impossible. To this day, I avoid being alone in isolated places. It seems exaggerated, but I can't control it. The idea of meeting someone new in a situation like that gives me chills. I wonder what happened to Elisa after that night. Did she get help? Or is she still out there, with that same strange smile and a knife hidden in her pocket? I never found out anything else about her. My family tried to move on, and so did I. But every time I hear about vacations at remote hotels, that sense of alertness comes back. Maybe it's an irrational fear, but one thing's for sure. I will never forget what happened that summer. And honestly, I hope I never cross paths with anyone like Elisa again. Emma. That's the name I always hated hearing in the middle of the night. Growing up, my mom would call me when something was wrong, as if the sound of my name carried with it the omen of trouble. So, when I heard the cry for help coming from outside that night, it felt as though, in some way, I already knew it wasn't going to end well. I was staying in a small motel in the middle of nowhere, something that seemed like a good idea until that moment. It was the last night before I was supposed to go home, and the silence of that place seemed perfect for a deep sleep. But at 2 a.m., everything changed. First, it was a low sound, like someone was talking louder than they should. But within seconds, it became impossible to ignore. It was screaming. Desperate screams that pierced through the thin walls of my room, as if they were right beside me. My heart immediately began to race. That kind of fear that paralyzes you before you can even think about anything. I tried to convince myself I wasn't hearing it, trying to tell myself it was just some random argument between guests. But the screams kept coming, begging for help in such a desperate way that ignoring them was no longer an option. I sat on the bed, trying to understand what was happening. The thin walls weren't enough to isolate the sounds, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was just the wind carrying the cries, the intensity of them left no room for doubt. The person screaming sounded as if they were in deep despair, as if there was no hope left. I looked out the window, but all I could see was the darkness, the vast emptiness of the field surrounding the motel. There were no lights, no movement. The place was so silent, yet so charged with tension, that I began to feel a weight in my stomach. Something wasn't right. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. I was completely alone out there, in the middle of nowhere, with those screams, and no idea where to turn for help. Panic suddenly overtook me. I knew I had to do something, but what? I stood there for a while, phone in hand, not sure whether I should call or not. I was alone, and yet it felt like I was being watched. I forced myself to call the police, even though I had no idea where the screams were coming from. I hear someone asking for help. Screams. I don't know where from, but it's real. It's really happening, I said, trying to keep calm, but my voice trembled. The operator seemed understanding, but also cautious, telling me to wait while they sent a patrol to check it out. Time passed slowly, and the screams didn't stop. They seemed to grow louder, as if the person outside was being forced to scream even harder with every passing second. I just wanted someone to arrive, but at the same time, part of me wished the screams would stop. I didn't know what was real anymore. I forced myself to stay calm as I waited, but each minute felt like an eternity. The screams didn't stop. They came from somewhere far off, but the sense that they were much closer than I imagined was terrifying. I knew I couldn't leave the room. I wasn't willing to risk going out there alone in that empty place. So I stayed put, listening, feeling each echo of those screams that seemed to pierce my soul. The worst part was the silence that followed. It was as if the world had hit pause, an agonizing pause, before the next wave of desperation hit. I could barely breathe, the fear consuming me. That feeling of helplessness was horrible, and all I wanted was to know what was happening. But there were no answers. There was no one to reassure me. When the police finally arrived, the screams stopped abruptly, as if someone had simply flipped a switch. I heard the patrol car approaching, its headlights slicing through the darkness, but before the lights could even reach the motel, the noise ceased completely. I stood there, motionless, trying to comprehend what was happening. The officers entered the area cautiously, but found nothing. No sign of who or what had been making those screams. They asked if I had heard anything, and I explained what had happened. But I couldn't offer a concrete explanation. It was as if, once they arrived, the night had returned to normal. No evidence, no trace of anything unusual. But I knew what I had heard. I knew something was wrong, and the emptiness of that response left a lump in my throat. The officers, after a few attempts at investigating, simply shrugged. They said it was probably some kind of distant argument, or maybe even an animal, although I knew there was absolutely nothing that could explain the human screams I had heard. But in the end, there was nothing they could do, and what remained was silence. I stayed there, in the motel's lobby, staring at the vacant faces of the officers as they walked away, as if it was just another normal occurrence, something that happened often around there. But for me, something wasn't right. I knew something far more sinister had occurred. The fact that no one else had heard it, that no one else seemed concerned, made me feel an even deeper sense of loneliness. The feeling of helplessness stayed with me until the very last minute. After the officers left, I still heard the echo of a scream, but this time it was different. It was as though the sound was coming from inside me, something that manifested itself as a reminder of what I still hadn't fully understood. I wanted to leave immediately, but I didn't know how. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of confused thoughts, mixed with that sound. I tried to sleep, but the image of those screams, so real, so desperate, never left my mind. When dawn came, it seemed like nothing had happened. Everything was calm, silent, and even more terrifying. The day began like any other, but I could never forget that sound. And to this day, I wonder who was screaming and what really happened that night. I never knew, and I never will. What happened that night never had an explanation. There were no traces of anything, and I never learned what that scream was. I tried going back there a few weeks later, still hoping to find some clue or answer, but the place was empty. The motel was shut down shortly after my stay, and no one could say why. The scariest part is that despite everything that happened, it seemed like no one cared, as if it was just something normal in that area, something that didn't deserve any more attention. Today, whenever I catch myself thinking about that night, I feel a chill. I never could understand what that sound was, but it stuck in my memory like a shadow. Every time I hear a distant scream, I remember the fear of not knowing whether it was real or just my mind trying to explain something inexplicable. And the worst part, the feeling that somehow I didn't do enough. But in the end, maybe I'll never know what really happened that night. Maybe it's better that way. The uncertainty, that emptiness, is what haunts me to this day. I've always enjoyed my work. I was 19 years old, and although I worked as a receptionist at a modest hotel by the roadside near US 101, I felt comfortable with the routine. The hotel was small but cozy, and there was always a sense of calm in the air. I didn't mind working the night shift, which meant fewer people and, in theory, fewer problems. The slow pace gave me time to focus, even to gaze at the ocean, which was right there, so close on the horizon. But something about that shift was different. Something told me the night wouldn't end like the others. I was there, alone at the desk, holding my newborn in a baby carrier, unaware that this would be the beginning of an experience that would change my life forever. The door opened around 2 a.m. A man walked in, and his gaze was the first sign that something was wrong. He didn't look out of the ordinary at first. A robust man, wearing a dark coat with disheveled hair and a tired expression, as if he had been traveling for hours. He walked straight to the desk, but the way he looked at me, with that intense and uncomfortable stare, sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to stay polite, as I always did, asking if he needed anything, but I quickly realized he wasn't in his right mind. His voice, hoarse and sluggish, began to unnerve me. "You have no idea what I went through to get here, girl," he said, with a smile that wasn't friendly. The smell of alcohol was coming off him, and his eyes were dangerously dilated. He was more than just tired. He was clearly intoxicated, and that made me anxious. I tried to remain calm, as I had been taught during my training, and gently asked him again if he needed help. But he didn't seem interested in booking a room or asking for anything. He just stood there, staring at me, tapping his fingers on the desk in a way that sounded almost threatening. "Are you scared of me?" he asked, with a short, dry laugh that chilled me to the bone. I tried to smile, though my heart was pounding, and told him no, that I was just there to help him with whatever he needed. But this seemed to anger him. He leaned over the desk, so close that I could feel his hot, acidic breath. "Don't lie to me, girl. I can see it in your eyes." My mind began to race, looking for a way out, as I pretended to search through the computer system, hoping to distract him. As he continued speaking in disjointed and increasingly aggressive sentences, I noticed he was fiddling with his coat pocket in a strange manner, as if searching for something. My stomach churned, and I knew I had to do something before the situation escalated. I quickly glanced at the phone on the desk, debating whether to call the police, but he noticed. "You're not going anywhere. Are you hearing me?" His voice echoed through the empty lobby, now full of rage. He pulled something from his pocket, a knife, large and shiny, reflecting the fluorescent light above us. The world seemed to spin as my body froze for a moment, but my survival instinct quickly took over. With my baby strapped to my chest, I knew I couldn't afford to make a mistake. There was no room for hesitation. My brain was in panic mode, but my legs wouldn't move. He moved even closer, and the sound of the blade being unsheathed cut the air with a chilling precision. "What are you going to do now, huh?" he taunted, his gaze locked on my face. Sweat dripped down my forehead, but I knew I had to think fast. I looked to the side, where the older night receptionist was watching with a lost, fearful look. I didn't know if she had sensed what I had, or if she was waiting for someone to act. But I couldn't wait any longer. With a quick move, I stepped back, as stealthily as I could, while he remained focused on me. When he leaned in again, trying to intimidate me further, I made my decision. I jumped to the side and ran toward the room behind the desk, where I knew the security controls were. Amid the rush of adrenaline, I felt the weight of my baby, but I didn't stop. I locked the door behind me with force, the sound of the latch echoing loudly in the silence of the night. My heart was beating so hard I could almost hear it in my head, and for a moment, I thought he might hear it too. I curled up in the corner of the room, holding my baby as best as I could, trying not to make a sound. The seconds stretched out like hours. Then, the sound of the man banging on the door and shouting began to blend with the sound of my ragged breathing. "You think you're going to escape, girl?" He was there, banging harder with each hit, but somehow he didn't seem to be trying to break the door down yet. Maybe he was sure that I was too desperate to act. Fear took over me, but I knew the only thing I could do now was call the police. My hands were shaking so badly that the first attempt to dial the number was a disaster. Finally, I managed. "Hello," the police voice said on the other end. My breath was so fast that I could barely speak. I'm being attacked at the hotel by a man with a knife." And then, in a calmer tone, still trying to stay composed, I added, "He's trying to kill me." The police were on their way, but time seemed to crawl with each second. All I could hear was the thudding of my heart and his raspy shouting from outside. He was getting angrier, trying to force the door with such force that the wood creaked. The baby started crying, probably scared by the noise, and that only heightened my panic. My heart was in my throat, and with every movement he made at the door, I wondered if it would be the last before he got in. I thought about everything: my life, the future I hoped to give my child, the simple things we took for granted that suddenly seemed so precious. The worst part was knowing that, at that moment, the place I considered safe, a simple hotel by a quiet road, had turned into a battleground for survival. And then, the sound of the siren. I don't know if I cried from relief or fear, but the pressure on my chest eased. He, on the other hand, grew even more aggressive, shouting words I couldn't understand, but that were certainly threatening. It was as if he knew the only thing standing between him and action was the arrival of the police. It didn't take long before I heard quick footsteps down the hallway, followed by authoritative voices. The door was forced open, but not roughly. They were meticulous, professional. I could see the door being pushed aside, and 2 officers entered, their hands ready to subdue him. The man was there, crouching, still holding the knife, but he was quickly disarmed and taken to the ground with ease. The sound of the metal hitting the cold floor was the most strangely comforting sound I'd ever heard. He was handcuffed and taken away without resistance, but the relief came with a bitter taste because the feeling that the danger had passed didn't erase the weight of the experience. When the officers finally left, I stayed there, motionless, trying to process what had just happened. The silence that followed was one of the most intense I'd ever felt, as if the world had stopped for a moment. The baby, now calmer, went back to sleep in my arms. I felt drained, but at the same time grateful to be alive. Grateful that I'd managed to protect my child. The receptionist, still frightened, came to the door of the room, looking at me with wide eyes. We didn't exchange a word. It wasn't necessary. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, absorbing the same feeling of terror, now more distant, but still very much present. I knew the hotel would have to be shut down for investigation, and that night would be my last shift there. I didn't know exactly what I'd do next, but something inside me told me that I couldn't work those night shifts anymore. That environment, which until then had seemed simple and safe, had now become a prison that locked me in the memory of something I could never forget. When I finally left, it was morning, and the sky was clear, as if nothing had happened. The road was still there, the same, but now it seemed different. I who once saw it as just a simple path home, now saw something darker in it. The experience changed me in ways I can't explain, not just because of the violence itself, but because of the shock of how life can flip upside down in an instant. I knew I needed time to recover, to understand that despite everything, I was alive. But I also knew that by leaving that hotel behind, I was taking an important step toward a new beginning. I don't know if I'll ever go back there, but the lesson I learned that night stayed with me. Even the places that seem the safest can hide the greatest nightmares. I was a receptionist at a luxury hotel in Zermatt, a small town nestled in the heart of the Swiss Alps, and, as usual, I was working the night shift. The place had that cold charm, with its imposing facade and empty corridors that echoed the sound of every footstep. The apparent peace was what drew me in the most. The people who chose that hotel were mostly tourists seeking a refuge from the hustle and bustle of the world. But on that March 20th, something wasn't right. I didn't know it yet, but the tranquility that had always surrounded me was about to be shattered in a way I could never have imagined. It was around 11 p.m. when the couple appeared at the front desk. He seemed like an ordinary man, but there was a tense energy about him that I couldn't quite place. His gaze spoke of impatience, as if he were constantly waiting for something. She, on the other hand, seemed exhausted. Her dark hair was loose, her eyes swollen, and her smile forced, as though she was trying to hide something she couldn't or didn't want to admit. The baby in her arms was calm, with curious, innocent eyes, but there was something in the air that didn't match the peace he radiated. The woman looked at him in a way I couldn't explain, as though she were trying to convince herself of something she already knew. I didn't realize it at the time, but an odd sensation began to settle in me. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I escorted them to the elevator, and as the man pressed the button with an anxious haste, the woman cast a furtive glance at me. It was only for a second, but it was enough for me to feel the weight of something unseen, something unspoken but tangible. When the elevator doors closed, a chill ran down my spine. It was a strange feeling, one I couldn't shake. I tried to distract myself by returning to the front desk, but I couldn't stop thinking about the way that woman had looked at the man. And that's when I heard it. The first noise coming from the second floor. The sound was muffled, but impossible to ignore. A door slamming shut with force, shouting. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. It wasn't uncommon to hear arguments in a hotel, especially in such a quiet setting at night, but the intensity of the noise was different. The voices were loud and aggressive, and soon followed the sound of something breaking. I stood up from my chair, looking around, trying to figure out what was happening. Something inside me told me this wasn't just a simple couple's quarrel. I ran to the reception phone, thinking about calling security. But before I could dial, the argument escalated, followed by a scream. A scream that chilled me to the bone. It was the woman, and it sounded like pure desperation. Without a second thought, I grabbed their room key and rushed to the second floor. The hallway was empty, and the weak light from the flickering lamp cast unsettling shadows on the walls. When I reached the door to their room, what I saw paralyzed me. He was on top of her, hitting, punching, while she desperately tried to protect the baby. The floor was stained with something I couldn't identify from a distance. I knew I couldn't stand there, watching, but my body wouldn't move. I don't know if it was fear or sheer disbelief, but I stood frozen for a second, unsure of what to do. It was the baby's cry that broke me from my paralysis. Something about that sharp, desperate sound snapped me out of my inertia, and an unexpected rage took over me. I couldn't let this happen. Without fully knowing what I was doing, I pushed the door open forcefully, making a noise that caught Marcus's attention. He turned instantly, his eyes filled with fury, as if he had never seen me before, and raised the knife he was holding, glinting in the dim light. He was no longer the nervous man I had seen at the front desk, but a monster, completely out of his mind. "Get out of here, you crazy woman," he shouted, his voice hoarse, as if possessed. He lunged at me with the knife, and, on impulse, I stepped back, searching for something to protect myself with. I looked to the side, desperate. That's when I saw the wooden chair in front of the room's desk. I grabbed it without hesitation, lifting it in front of me like a shield. Marcus hesitated for a moment, but then charged again. He seemed to know I was weaker than him, but I had the advantage of surprise. With all the strength I could muster, I shoved the chair towards him, making him stumble and lose his balance for a second. I seized the opportunity and pulled Lena, who had collapsed on the floor, toward the baby. She was gasping for breath, her face pale, and seemed too weak to stand. "Go to the boiler room," I told her, practically dragging her and the baby by the hand. The adrenaline made me act without thinking, without questioning anything. We managed to get to the boiler room, and I slammed the door behind us with a bang that made my heart race even faster. Inside, the smell of hot oil and rusted metal almost suffocated me. The place was small and dark, but at least it was safe, for now. I looked at Lena, who was trembling, the baby in her arms, clinging to her with wide, frightened eyes. Her breathing was irregular, and I saw her hands shaking as she held the child. I crouched down to talk to her, trying to calm her, but my gaze kept drifting toward the door, waiting for the moment Marcus would appear. "It's going to be okay," I said, trying, in vain, to convince myself it was true. What else could I say? The reality was that it was out of my control. With every noise coming from the hallway, my body stiffened, and my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. Then I heard the footsteps, distant but unmistakable. He was coming toward us, and I knew there was no time. Fear flooded me in a way I had never felt before. I looked at Lena, who met my gaze, her eyes red from crying, and she didn't need to say anything. We both knew Marcus was coming, and all we could do was wait. Wait for the police to arrive before he found us. I squeezed her hands, trying to offer some sense of security, but I couldn't hide the anxiety that had taken hold of me. And then, the police sirens blared in the distance. A brief moment of relief washed over me, but the tension didn't ease. What was going through my mind? How could a simple night shift, which always seemed so peaceful, have turned into such a nightmare? The sense of relief was almost instant when the corridor door opened and voices began shouting orders. The lights of the police uniforms illuminated the space, and I could finally breathe a little more easily. The sound of boots on the corridor floor seemed muffled by the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. When the boiler room door was opened, the first thing I saw was the face of one of the officers, a serious expression, but with the relief of someone who knew We had managed to protect ourselves. "It's okay now," he said, but the knot in my throat remained. Lena was fragile, but relieved. The baby, however, seemed oblivious to the violence that had just unfolded, sleeping peacefully in her arms. The police were quick, and soon the sound of handcuffs being slapped onto Marcus echoed through the boiler room. He was in shock, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. But I knew what he had done, and so did he. There was no denying it. After the incident, the hotel was silent. The kind of silence that comes after trauma. The kind where no one knows how to fill the space. I couldn't work the night shift anymore. My mind was completely out of place, and my body seemed to be in a constant state of alert. The memory of Marcus's furious gaze, the feeling of fear and helplessness as I faced that situation, all of it haunted me. And the truth is, as much as the police did their job, what happened that night stayed with me. I could never look at the hotel the same way again, and the atmosphere that once felt calm and safe now only brought back terrifying memories. I never returned to my night shift. I decided my mental health wasn't worth the risk. To this day, I wonder how something like that could happen in a place where people expect to feel protected and welcomed. Security, it turns out, is just an illusion. I never knew what happened to Marcus after he was arrested. I don't know if he was convicted or if justice was served as it should have been. What I do know is that, in the end, the scars stayed with me. Not in the form of physical marks, but something no one can see. Something deeper. I could never look at the night the same way again. And whenever I see a small child, I remember that moment when I tried to protect that baby who didn't even understand what was happening. Life, suddenly, taught me in the most brutal way that not all places that seem safe really are, no matter how perfect the facade. In the blink of an eye, reality can turn into a nightmare. Now, all I can do is move forward, trying to erase the images from my mind, but I know the shadow of that night will always stay with me. I never imagined that a backpacking trip across Europe would end like this. I was alone, traveling through the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, and had decided to stop at a remote inn to rest before continuing my journey. The inn was simple but welcoming, with a bar downstairs where I found a friendly, cozy atmosphere. The owner, Andre, was very kind, and after dinner, he offered me a local drink I had never tried before. It was a sweet, strong liquor, and he insisted I have another glass, then another. I was tired, and with the night growing colder, I thought it wouldn't hurt. I took several shots, always accompanied by water, but soon started feeling dizzy. Something felt off, like the drink was having a stronger effect than usual. Andre seemed to find it amusing, and the cook, Mihai, was nearby. But I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to enjoy the evening. The last thing I remember is trying to make my way to my car, already late, when the effects of the drink hit me hard. But before I could reach the door, Andre and Mihai stopped me. They said I shouldn't drive in my condition, and that it would be better to stay and rest a little longer. What frightened me was their insistence, as if they were trying to convince me I had no other choice. Something wasn't right. They didn't seem sincere, and fear began to grow inside me. I didn't want to go to my room, didn't want to be alone with those two. But before I knew it, I was being taken to the inn's basement. Panic set in. I tried to fight, but my vision was blurry, and my body didn't respond. Before I could do anything else, I was knocked out. I woke up in a completely different place, my body aching. I was no longer in my car, lying on a hard floor, and the pain in my abdomen was unbearable. As I tried to move, I realized something was terribly wrong. When I looked down, I saw the blood, and with horror, I realized my kidney had been removed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was the victim of an organ trafficking scheme, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Andre and Mihai, the owner and the cook of the inn, were behind this, or at least involved. I knew I had to get out of there, but what terrified me the most was that I didn't have the strength to get up. I was alone in a remote place, with no one around to help. My thoughts were confused, and all I wanted was to escape, but my body wouldn't cooperate. With great effort, I managed to get up, and leaning against the walls of the basement, I began to walk toward the car. Every step felt harder than the last, and the pain was relentless. When I finally reached it, I could barely see the road ahead, but I knew I had to get away. I drove aimlessly, doing my best to distance myself from that nightmare. The fear of being followed, of Andre and Mihai being behind me, consumed me. At every turn, at every shadow, I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that I was safe, the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. I knew I had been used, manipulated, and that they were still out there doing the same thing to others. But there was no one I could turn to. When I reached a larger town, I didn't hesitate to stop at a hospital. I was exhausted, the pain paralyzing me, and I didn't know how to process what had happened. The doctors were horrified by the severity of the situation, and they quickly ran tests. That's when the diagnosis was confirmed. My kidney had been removed. I was admitted immediately, and while I was in the hospital, the police arrived to question me. They wanted to know what had happened, how I had ended up there, and who the people involved were. I tried to remember every detail, but my mind was in shock. So many things were fuzzy, as if I had been separated from it all by an invisible curtain. But one thing was clear. I knew what had happened. Those people had drugged me, manipulated me, and used me for something much more sinister. With every question, the terror returned, and I found myself trying to piece together a story that didn't seem possible. I spent several days in the hospital under the care of the doctors, and the investigation began soon after. At first, I thought it was just a matter of time before they caught Andre and Mihai. They were the main suspects, and the inn seemed to be at the center of it all. But as the weeks passed, reality set in. They disappeared, vanished without a trace. The police searched the place, but found nothing concrete to lead them to them. Months later, I received a call from the police station. They informed me that although the investigation was ongoing, Andre and Mihai had not yet been found. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. I knew that, even after all the pain and months of suffering, the battle was not won. They were still out there, and the fear that others might go through the same thing consumed me. The police assured me they would continue the search, but deep down, I knew there were no guarantees. Not for me, not for anyone.